Is Prowess evolving? About time to say goodbye to Jeskai?
Bye-bye.
And is the most winning deck found underground? All of this and more, starting now. I'm starting to wonder if y'all are getting a little bit sick of me. It's another week and it's another regional championship, this time on the East Coast of the United States in Hartford, Connecticut, where SCGCON just took place to the tune of 930 players slinging standard spells. Now, of course, the talk of the town was if the Prowess deck was going to be as prevalent and what was going to rise up to challenge that deck. Now, in this video, as always, we are going to not only answer those questions, but also go over just the broad strokes of what the metagame looked like at the RC in total. Then we're going to take a look at what decks were most popular and then compare those tiers of popularity amongst themselves, just in case you want to get a feel for how those decks might do at your local events or at your LGS or in your Moto leagues or whatever. Then we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at what decks were the most winning at the RC, regardless of how many copies they actually had in the room. And then finally, we're going to look at that coveted head-to-head matchup matrix of the top 10 Presence decks, so you know what the top tier of the standard metagame is looking like. Now again, just a quick explanation of where the data is coming from. We are using Melee Platform's tournament report, which does have 930 players with 930 decks. But as always, I did find 3 troll deck lists, which I classified as the only lands trolls, since all 3 players conveniently registered 60 plus land deck lists. So I guess more power to them to grouping them all together at least. Now, other than that, I have not touched any of the archetype names, and I made sure not to count buys, but intentional draws do still count an overall record. And I'm still not including the top 8 matches in this specific data set. So rapid fire on this info so we could jump right into everything else. As I mentioned, Hartford had 930 players and they were on 76 different archetypes, or 75 once you eliminate the 3 lists of pure lands from the equation. Now, of all of these lists, 33 of them were the only copy in the hall, accounting for 43.4% of the total decks. 16 deck archetypes had 2 copies being played in Hartford, making up for 21.1% of that breakdown. Now, including the 3 pilots that did have the troll lists, 9 deck archetypes had 3 copies at the RC with a little asterisk next to it, which accounts for 11.8% of the archetypes there. While there was only a single deck archetype with both 4 or 5 copies in the room, so just a tiny 1.3% of the decks being represented at the RC. That left 21.1% of the room, or 16 different archetypes, with 6 or more pilots playing the deck at Hartford. Of all of these decks, there was one that clearly stood out above the rest as the single most popular deck for the 3rd RC in a row. Yep, that's right. Izzet Prowess had 335 copies of the deck being played, which accounted for a clean 36% of the Hartford metagame, which is over a third of the entire event. We'll see if that popularity translated to power a little bit later in the video. The next most played deck was something different than previous events, as the Azorius Omniscience deck picked up enough steam to see 101 copies being played for about 10.9% metagame share. Jeskai Oculus fell a bit in play right after the RC in Minneapolis, where it was the 2nd most played deck, having just 84 copies at Hartford, which still made it the 3rd most played deck and owned 9% of the metagame share. Oh, speaking of Minneapolis, the winning deck archetype from that event, Jeskai Control, was the 4th most played deck in Hartford, with 57 total pilots and a 6.1% metagame share, which is less total decks, but a higher meta share than the previous event that it won. The Domain deck, aka their Overlords, took a massive hit to its play rate, falling down to just 39 total decks registered with a 4.2% metagame share, even though Pro Tour winner with the deck Matt Nass brought it to Hartford himself. Even more of a downfall in popularity than Domain was Mono Red Aggro. It dropped off a cliff in play rate, down from 104 decks and a 7.1% metagame share in Minneapolis just like 2 weekends ago, all the way to 38 decks and a 4.1% metagame share. Mono Black Demons is still hanging around the top of the standard metagame tables, as 36 players decided to sleeve up the demonic deck for Hartford, making up 3.9% of the RC metagame share. Now, in similar numbers to Demons, another black-based deck in Dimir Midrange also had 36 copies in the room for the same metagame share with 3.9%, which climbed in popularity from the last event in Minneapolis by 1 whole percentage point. We're not done with Demons yet. Orzhov Demons took what the Mono Blacklist was doing and added white as a way to deal with some resolved artifacts and enchantments in an easier way, swaying 30 pilots to the list for a 3.2% metagame share. Meanwhile, the statistical quote-unquote prowess slayer, Orzhov Pixie, actually went down in representation, with 28 decks for 3% of the metagame share. No doubt options like Orzhov Demons swayed some Pixie pilots away from the deck that had not such a great matchup outside of just prowess and aggro lists. Other decks to note at the event were the 9 copies of Azorius Control, dropping the red and the Shiko as 9 players made up 1% of the RC, 7 copies of Gruul Delirium giving violent urges to 0.8% of the room, and 2 copies of Jund Roots, let's go, using Cauldrons and Thrill Seekers to fill 0.2% of the metagame. Let's continue our discussion about how many decks were in the room by shifting to look at deck popularity and how different decks compared within their tiers. Now, for those that are newer here, popularity is something I've come up with that is used to rank the decks at each event with a letter grade from D tier up through S tier based on where they fall for that event's standard distribution of deck archetypes. Sounds a little mathy because it does use a little bit of math, but what this looks to show is not only how likely you are to encounter these decks on your own Magic the Gathering online or RCQ grind, but also take a bit of a closer look to see if popular also means powerful, or if they fell a little flat. Now, due to the overwhelming presence of Izzet Prowess at the event, it once again has skewed the distribution and is by far the only S-tier popularity deck at the event. The deck still continues to put up solid results despite an ever-growing base of pilots, putting up a 51.5% total match win rate at the RC, which is up a little less than 1 percentage point from Minneapolis's record. In fact, looking at the adjusted win rate here tells us that giving the deck to a random player for the event would find them winning roughly 46 to 57% of their matches, given a random smattering of opponents and a 95% confidence rating. This would trend towards Izzet being the deck to pick up to play if you want to put up as close to break-even results as possible, with a slight edge on that positive side. Now, does that mean the deck needs to be hit by the community's beloved Banhammer? I'm not entirely sold on that part, as the deck itself at this event here iterated on its own list with the main decking of Drakecatcher over Slickshot Show-Off, and then went up on into the Floodmaw copies and reduced the overall speed of the deck, which has made some of the decks that were previously worse into the deck actually better against it, as we'll divulge a little more into later on. But as it stands, it is a fact that Izzet is both the most popular and arguably one of the most powerful decks you could bring to a standard event right this moment. Once again, thanks to the popularity of Prowess, the A tier is a little barren at this event and is populated by just one deck that I don't think a lot of people anticipated being the second most played deck in the room. Azorius Omniscience didn't have the strongest performance into Prowess lists at the last few events, although it did line up well against the winning Jeskai control list from RC Minneapolis. In fact, Omniscience had the most copies of a deck in that top 8, and the Jeskai list just dodged them all. So while it did perform decently last week, I don't think we expected this many people to pick up the quote-unquote counter-meta type of deck. As for how it went, well, it wasn't the best weekend for Omni, as the highest placing list was outside of top 16, and the deck overall had a below average performance at 47.6% win rate. The addition of Meringue River region in lieu of the more combo-centric nature of the deck with its invasions and such definitely has the deck made more accessible, easier to play, and more appealing to pilots across the board. But I'm not sure it's the best metagame choice right this moment. The B tier is where we get to see two deck archetypes next to one each other for the first time, and both of them are Jeskai lists. The Oculus deck was something I had called out last weekend as something to play if you were expecting a lot of prowess, but had a hard time into Dimir and Domain. Well, Domain went down, but Dimir went up, and that coupled with the changing of the prowess main decks made Oculus more awkward than powerful this weekend as it fell down in win rate. However, of the two Jeskai decks, it was still better suited with its main game plan than the control variant was, as a lot of players attempted to recreate the success of the deck that had last week just won the event, only to be met with a different version of prowess, way more copies of Azorius Omniscience, and a slowly rising tide of Dimir decks. Jeskai Control seems like one of those decks you really need to have a read on the metagame for in order to end up with a decent record, which means you need to put in more work than just reps on a deck in order to see it perform. Now, of these two decks that share colors, the Oculus deck is the one that would be my guess as to the one you might see more often at your local events. But with two back-to-back below average performances, I think it might pivot towards something of a different configuration, maybe even dropping the blue. Finally, in C tier, we have literally all of the other top 10 Presence decks, which also means this is where we see all of our other decks with a 50% or better win rate, such as Mono Red Aggro and Dimir Midrange, which had absolutely stellar performances this weekend, with the former Aggro archetype taking down the entire event. The main decking of cards like Magebane Lizard, coupled with the slowing down of the Prowess Shell, really flipped fortunes for Mono Red, enough to bring it up 8.1 percentage points compared to the result it had just a little while ago in Minneapolis. Now, Dimir Midrange also saw a 3.5 percentage point increase in average win rate this event, just barely eking out Mono Red as the winningest top 10 deck at the event. The story with Dimir is even more interesting, as the deck itself didn't really see many changes since the last time it was doing well in Standard, with a few lists running one or two Karsi Revenant and maybe a sideboard Scavenger region as the main additions. It just so happens that the ebb and flow of Standard has swung back into Dimir's game plan being good again, and pilots are riding that wave, baby. Now, Abzan Pixie was also able to bounce back to a 50% win rate this weekend. Even though there weren't a ton of people playing the deck, it continues to feast on the aggro decks while being decent into some of the mid-range decks, which balanced out in the end for all of its weaker matchups. We'll take a look at that closer a little bit later on. Now, the clear losers of the C tier are unfortunately the demon variants, which I don't expect to see much longer with the way that Dimir is performing right now. Bounce spells from Prowess, tempo plays from Dimir, and a lack of aggro decks in Hartford made these decks full of expensive haymakers just too slow and clunky to compete with the rest of Standard. Oh yeah, and domains or overlords, that deck's still kicking. Although it did kind of feel the brunt of tempo decks instead of pure aggro, and although going up to 4 high noons in the 75 is a smart choice, you can then look at 42nd place's Avi Lashur if you're hellbent on playing this type of deck still. Now that we've gone through what was popular in the room, let's weave our way through all the decks and pick out the ones that did the most winning at the RC, regardless of how many copies were actually there. Now, a quick reminder that sample size does matter, and when looking at these decks, I am not advocating for them being the strongest decks of the format, just something for brewers and innovators in the format to keep their eyes on. Additionally, this was a 2-day event with a cutoff of 18 match points in order to make the second day. So, decks with 5 wins did not make that cut, unless they also had 3 ties. So be wary of that when we are looking at these lists and their overall records and performance. A Jund version of the Insidious Roots deck went all the way to 10th place, just barely missing the top 8 while doing all sorts of graveyard-based shenanigans. This version of the deck had a Steelmancer Adept, Tyvar Jubilant Brawler as the package in order to play a combo-centric version of the deck, while it ran a singleton copy of Voldaren Thrillseeker and Agatha's Soul Cauldron in order to kill its opponents via flinging increasingly large plants at their faces. Now, for those who are unaware, the Adept allows you to forage to cast creature spells from your graveyard, similar to an Underworld Breach. So exiling a creature to forage in order to cast one nets 2 plants per roots in play, while Snarling Gorehounds in play triggers Surveils in order to keep the graveyard stocked. And yes, you can Impending an Overlord from the graveyard. This archetype has been a blast to learn, but sadly I don't recommend picking up the combo version as we'll be losing both Tyvar and Thrillseeker to rotation soon, so sticking to a fair game plan with a Golgari Roots deck will be where you want to go. More on that later. Selesnya Stompy, or what we're calling the Selesnya Collector's Cage deck nowadays, did well enough to secure 43rd place with an 11-4-0 record in the hands of pilot Steven Borakov. Tokens is the name of the game, as Elspeth Stormslayer will double them, and Sandstorm Salvager will grow them. All will cards like Sanguine Evangelist pump the board with early battle cry swings, and stashing a Crater Hoof Behemoth under a collector's cage is a fast way to force a GG from your opponents. Brightglass Gearhulk has a tutor package of 1-drops, from Paw Patch Recruit to get the board going, to Duskrose Reliquary to answer whatever your opponent is doing. Oh, and just being a large threat in and of itself. I feel like this is the second or third time I'm talking about Boros Monument as a top 10 win rate deck at these RC events, and for pretty good reason. With the metagame slowing down a little bit, or at least the prowess decks building their lists in a way that slows them down, Boros Monument is doing similar things to Jeskai Oculus, only their longer game plan is a triple ability artifact over a 5/5 flying eyeball. Able to do some downright silly things when you can copy Monument with the Mycosynth Gardens, and when you have Guardian of New Benalia as a repeatable discard outlet, pilot Benton Madison took the deck to a 33rd place finish with another 11-4-0 record. A Temur version of the Tolarian Terror decks put up a 9-5-1 record in pilot Mark Paulson's hands, and the deck wasn't just a normal Terror deck splashing Corey Steelcutter. The deck looked like some of the Izzet Prowess lists from RC Minneapolis that ran copies of Tolarian Terror and Hearth Elemental as the main creature threats alongside a slew of spells to sling, but Songcrafter Mage added an angle to this deck specifically that allowed for things like stock up to cost 1 mana, and let cards like Fiery Annihilation be played main deck in order to remove larger threats while triggering the cutter with reduced mana costs. Also of note, not an Up the Beanstalk in sight. But there are beanstalks in this next list. That didn't last long, as the more traditional style of Terror deck in Simic Terror had pilot Ryan Donkin finish 18th overall and snag a PT invite. One of the original homes of the This Town Talent Loot package, the full 4 Tolarian Terror and Eddie Merc Crabs were large enough threats, especially when cast early or in multiples thanks to 26 instants and sorceries, to tap down prowess threats and stonewall a lot of the ground creatures currently seeing play in Standard. Now here's the more fair version of Roots. The Golgari Roots deck with no combo inside of it had a 57.1% win rate in the hands of pilot Episkey. I think that's how you say it. Now, this was looking to create moderately sized plant armies thanks to cards like Molt Tender, Scavenging Ooze, and Karsi Revenant. 7 total mill spells between Cash Grab and Dredger's Insight get added on to Overlord of the Baelmerc in the absence of Tyvar, giving you plenty of fodder for Skoos and Soul Cauldron to choose from, while Roots just slowly amasses an army worthy of defending any lawn I've seen. Sticking to 2 colors also gives access to multiple copies of Great Arishan City, which is a Moorland Haunt type card for those modern players that can trigger our Insidious Roots and enters untapped if we have a Forest in play, which will create spirits by exiling creatures from our graveyard. Temur Otters is still alive and kicking? Although I feel like I say this every few standard events as well as the Boros Monument thing, the original Otter combo deck is still putting up performances in multiples, mostly due to my local Tinfang 1. Now, using your Valley Floodcaller to untap your Otters as they tap for mana thanks to Enduring Vitality, eventually they get to be so large, or you have enough mana for a lethal Song of Totentans, which is a 2 of in the highest placing 9, 6, and 0 list from pilot Thomas Swan, to swarm the board with Hasty Rats. Or you get to use the song for just 1 mana to give your Otters haste in order to combo off that turn. Abzan Pixie had 3 copies in the room, and while the deck is no longer packing skirmish rhinos, it's still looking to do some silly things with its bounce package of Nurturing Pixie and newest addition to the fray, Sun Pearl Kirin. Severance Priest is another new Tarkir Dragonstorm addition that allows you to effectively Thoughtseize your opponent, but it gets exiled for as long as you have the Priest in play. Now, if the Priest leaves the battlefield, they get a token with power and toughness equal to the mana cost of the spell. It's effectively a hand disruption Skyclave apparition. Well, if you bounce the Priest to remove their hand 1 by 1, they might get an army of tokens. Unless you play your own temporary lockdowns to clear the board of anything but your 3 drops or higher. Yathan Roadwatcher is the key other card here, and although it's 4 mana altogether, it works in tandem with Overlord of the Baelmerk to utilize the graveyard from this deck as well, and bring back creatures 3 mana or less, including all of our bounce cards and our Priest. Boros Mice had the most copies out of all of these top 10 win rate decks, and seems like it was the way the designers intended the Mice package to be used. Looking almost like a Bloomborough block constructed deck, everyone's quote-unquote favorite trio of red mice get backups from Lord effects from Flowerfoot Swordmaster's Valiant Trigger, Valley Quest Caller, and the hero of the story themselves, Mabel Heir to Cragflame. The deck still sports the red deck package of Monstrous Rage and Burst Lightning, but gets to tag team these all-stars with 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts as a way to answer anything opposing decks can throw at it, or attempt to throw at it. Lastly, rounding out this top 10 was a deck that got its own video deck tech on stream, but unfortunately failed to make day 2. The quote-unquote 4-color zoo deck, which has since been renamed to the Grim Captain combo, is a one-of-a-kind brew that looks to unite all different creature types of Ixalan into one giant, menacing, trampling, life-linking, and hexproof threat. It can then also force your opponent to sacrifice anything non-land, while slapping something you've crafted with it onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking already. So things from Trumpeting Carnosaur to Atali Primal Conqueror, or even just Voldaren Thrillseeker to cause lethal flings post-combat can just pop out of a flip throne. Now the rest of the deck, either things to craft with, or ways to get them in the graveyard. The deck does get a boost from Taurine Mauler being printed in Foundations, which can sub in as any one type, but not all 4. But this deck is very all or nothing on the throne plan, which is why it barely missed day 2.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others, especially compared to the Prowess deck. So this is more of a general guideline as to how a matchup may go, rather than a be-all, end-all type of stack ranking.
Izzet Prowess, the most played deck at the event, the most played deck in Standard for quite a few weeks at this point, has put up extremely impressive results for a deck. Looking at the matchup spread across the top 10 decks, there are only 3 decks in the room that can claim to have a slight edge against the deck. One of which we've already has been known as a quantity in Orzhov Phoenix with a 42.9% win rate for Izzet Prowess in that matchup, and the other one being just a little below 50-50 in the Xur Overlords list, which is surprising considering that list was a little bit too slow for the more aggressive packages of Izzet Prowess. Now, the one deck in the room, and no, it's not the Mirror, that can claim to be effective against the current iteration of Izzet Prowess is the previous Scourge of Standard. The mono red aggro deck in the main deck configuration it packed for this event wound up having Izzet Prowess down to a 39% win rate in the head-to-head matchup, which is completely flipped from the almost 50-50 it was just a few weekends ago in Minneapolis. So the configuration that the mono red decks are running with Mage Bane Lizards and keeping the speed aspect of their deck intact, while Izzet Prowess has been slowing down a little bit and putting Drake Hatchers in the main deck and getting rid of their speed attribute in the Slick Shot show-off, is starting to make it so that these decks that go fast can actually go underneath the Izzet Prowess deck. Now, when you look at the Izzet win rate compared to all of the non-mirror matchups, it actually goes up by a decent margin, 1.3 percentage points total. So while people did kind of come prepared to deal with an aggressive Izzet Prowess shell, the shifting towards a slower bounce package, more copies of Into the Flood Maw, and the configuration that Izzet had for the mirror matchup has been just trouncing some of the decks that originally did good against it. The main things to point out here are the mono black demons and the Orzhov version of the demons deck as well, as both of these decks suddenly became more than 50% win rate favorites for Izzet Prowess, while the Jeskai control list that beat up on it in Minneapolis is now a favorable matchup for Prowess due to the main deck configuration circumventing the package that the control list was running. So I have a feeling that as Izzet gets iterated on more and more, we're going to cycle through the different decks in Standard that are good and bad against it. But I do think that with a 51 to 52% win rate against the field, it's going to be difficult to not just play Prowess for the time being. Now, Azorius Omniscience, I called it sort of a counter meta deck, and looking at the spread of the matchups, it didn't look like it countered the half of the room that it wanted to. Now, we knew that Azorius Omniscience was not the greatest head-to-head matchup into the Izzet Prowess deck, but we did know that it was very good into the decks that were a little bit slow and couldn't necessarily interact with what it was doing. We see this in the 63.8% win rate against Jeskai Control and the 86.5% win rate against the Domain Xur Overlords deck. So I guess it's kind of good that that deck fell off for a little bit, since the second most popular deck in the room was just an awful matchup for it. Now, the Azorius Omniscience deck did pick up wins against the Orzhov and Mono Black list, specifically against the Orzhov Pixie list, which you're not going to be interacting with what the Orzhov Omniscience deck is going to be doing much if you're the Orzhov Pixie deck. But where it did have good matchups against some of the black-based mid-range and control decks, it absolutely suffered at the hands of Dimir mid-range, a 22% win rate in that head-to-head matchup there for the Azorius Omniscience deck. This, of course, is due to the fact that Dimir mixes a tempo game playstyle with a bunch of hand disruption and things to deal with the graveyard and the board, especially post-sideboard, meaning that the Omniscience deck really doesn't get its feet on the ground whatsoever in those games. Now, looking at the non-mirror match win rate, Azorius Omniscience fell a teeny tiny bit, just 0.3 percentage points in the win rate, but still going under 50% at an event this big and this important goes to show that Azorius Omniscience is not impervious to the field of standard decks. Jeskai Oculus put up some sub 50% win rate results against Prowess for the second event in a row, but continued to prey upon decks like Azorius Omniscience, Jeskai Control, and some of the decks like Mono Red Aggro, where it was sporting 60% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. but the decreasing size of the aggro decks in the field meant that Oculus's win rate also decreased alongside it. Now, it did wind up losing a bunch of these Xur Domain Overlords decks alongside with this shrinking field of decks, where this was a 39.3% win rate for the Oculus deck, so it wasn't looking good for the eyeball in the first place. But the uptick in Dimir mid-range pilots also was a difficult matchup for Jeskai Oculus, just like it was at the last couple of events, sporting a 37.5% win rate in the Dimir head-to-head. Now, while it was still halfway decent into mono black demons and still beat up on Orzhov Pixie, the emergence of Orzhov demons was a bad thing for the Oculus deck. A 26.3% win rate in that head-to-head matchup was extremely problematic for the Flying Eyeball deck. Now, when you look at non-mirror matches as well, the deck falls by 0.2 percentage points, which is not a significant amount of win rate, but the fact that it goes down when you remove the mirror matches just goes to show that the deck is not as well positioned as it was just 2 events ago in Bologna. Now, Jeskai Control won the most recent RC, but looking at this matchup spread, I don't think this deck is winning anything anytime soon. Now, we know that the deck was geared to fight off some of the more aggressive Izzet Prowess shells and succeeded last week, but the swap to be a little bit slower meant that the Izzet Prowess matchup was now a sub 50% win rate at 43.9% for the Jeskai Control deck. Now, we knew that Control struggled against Azorius Omniscience, and the uptick in that being the second most played deck was definitely a contributor to the downfall in Jeskai Control's success. Jeskai also struggled in the head-to-head sort of Jeskai mirror against its Oculus cousin at a 48.9% win rate there. Now, looking across the table, there's only 2 matchups where Jeskai was actually favored, one of which was the Xur Overlords deck, which Domain saw less pilots this weekend, and the Orzhov Pixie list, which also saw some less decks this weekend. Now, the rest of the decks in the room, including Dimir mid-range, which is spiking up again, were below 50% win rate, and Dimir mid-range even below 30% win rate at 27.3%. Now, the configurations of mono red aggro, packing some more Sunspine links in the sideboard and putting some Magebane lizards in their list to get some incremental damage against the control decks trying to multi-spell on a turn, definitely made this matchup a little bit better for the mono red side than it had been in the last couple of weeks. So Jeskai Control just had the wrong configuration to bring to the tables at Hartford this time around, and even taking out some of those mirror matches for the deck, things don't look too hot as you have a solid 43% win rate, which is the second worst overall of these top 10 Presence decks. The Domain Xur Overlords deck is sort of on a farewell tour of Standard right now, as some of the key cards, specifically the ones that say Domain in it, are going to be rotating at the end of the Standard season. However, looking at the matchup spread, it might already be on its way out the door. Now, the Xur Overlords deck has historically struggled against decks that are way too fast for and get underneath it, and mono red aggro at this event, despite only having 10 matches, well, that was the same percentage that Xur had in the head-to-head. Mono red smashed the configuration of Xur Overlords at this event. The Azorius Omniscience deck, able to basically win the game on turn 4 or 5 by bringing back a Omniscience with Nebulo's Awakening, was a 13.5% win rate for the Xur Overlords deck, just too fast and too furious for the Overlords to even compete with. Now, the Overlords deck plays like a control-style deck with a bunch of mid-range, slow setup, so that means the Jeskai Control deck, which is sort of a control mirror, was also a difficult one for it to navigate, and the Orzhov Demons deck, which is popping up in order to deal with artifacts and enchantments that the mono black list cannot, well, you could see in those head-to-heads how much that white splash actually helped that deck in the Xur Overlords head-to-head matchup altogether. So sadly, Xur doesn't like seeing that one pop up. Now, on the plus side, the Xur Overlords deck did run into about 20 mirror matches, and looking at the non-mirror win rate, it actually goes up by 0.3 percentage points. So a 45% win rate overall on the weekend is still not great, but the Domain deck is at least doing better than the Jeskai Control deck. Hey, who wants to talk about mono red? Actually feels like a little while since we've had a lot of positive things to say about this once menaced the standard format. But pilots in Hartford changed the mono red aggro list to be a little more mono red interactive, and instead of going towards the way that the Prowess deck was being built for speed, the red pilots decided to combat Prowess with cards like Magebane Lizard in the main deck, and then take out Monastery Swiss Spear in favor of cards like Hired Claw to guarantee some damage and make combat math a little more awkward for the blocking side of things. Now, this paid dividends for mono red, specifically in the Izzet Prowess matchup, where it boasted the highest win rate at 61% out of all of these top 10 Presence decks. Now, it did all of this without really affecting its win rate in the second most played deck head-to-head as well, as it had a 58.3% win rate against Azorius Omniscience. Now, the mono red aggro deck continues to beat up on these slower decks in the format, like Jeskai Control, Xur Overlords, and some of those more straight-up control lists. Now, where it does tend to start to suffer is the more mid-range interactive or mid-range cheaty matchups. Jeskai Oculus is only a 40% win rate for the mono red aggro deck, whereas the mono black demons and Orzhov demons lists are around 40 to 42.9% win rate as well, and the Orzhov Pixie list, which is literally built to beat mono red and Prowess, is of course a bad matchup for it. The one that I continue to be surprised about as we see these events, however, is the Dimir midrange deck, because one of the original reasons Dimir midrange got pushed out was the fact that its mono red matchup was not the greatest in the world, and the onset of the Pixie decks meant that bouncing their things was really awkward for the deck, and they actually went to Dimir bounce after that. But the mono red deck here is still at a below 50% win rate against Kaito and crew, 46.7% against Dimir, so something has definitely changed in that matchup, which mono red may want to take a look at in the future if Dimir continued to show up in numbers. Now, the mono red deck didn't have that many head-to-head matchups, or mirror matchups specifically, so the overall non-mirror win rate is a negligible improvement of 0.1 percentage points there. So all in all though, 55 to 55.1% win rate for a deck that people were saying was down and out compared to Prowess, that's a huge W for mono red this week. Alright, speaking of that Dimir mid-range deck, it's been picking up popularity again, and like I said, there's not a lot of changes to the main deck. You get Karsi Revenant, you get a Scavenger regen, and you get some more interactive hand disruption that specifically goes after Corey Steel Cutter, but you don't have a massive advantage in your Izzet Prowess head-to-head matchup. The Dimir midrange deck is actually good against every single top 10 deck except for Izzet Prowess at Hartford. I mean, look at the win rates it has against Azorius Omniscience, Jeskai Control, Mono Black Demons. These are 70+% win rates that the Dimir deck is putting up just by playing some interaction backed up by a moderate speed clock of tapping things down with Flip Pitch Drowner, drawing cards off of Enduring Curiosity, and slamming in a Kaito to bounce those cards back to your hand when you need them there. Now, the Dimir midrange deck may have some improvements it could make to combat Prowess a little bit more, and I don't know how that's going to affect the rest of its head-to-head matchups, but if the Dimir midrange deck is providing this amount of success, being like the counter meta deck that the Jeskai Control and Azorius Omniscience decks were trying to be, that might not be the worst place to be in the world if Izzet Prowess is the name of the standard game. Now, even looking at the non-mirror win percentage, which does only go up by a negligible 0.1 percentage points, the Dimir midrange deck was the winningest top 10 Presence deck at the event. So maybe something old is actually something new, and that new thing is pretty good. Alright, this one's gonna hurt me to say a little bit, but the Mono Black Demons deck was not good this weekend. I'm just gonna start on the opposite end of everything here. Mono Black Demons had the worst win rate out of the top 10 Presence decks here at Hartford. The non-mirror match win rate going below 43% at 42.9% win rate, which is just 0.1 below Jeskai Control, but still solidly makes Mono Black Demons the worst of these top 10 decks to have chosen at the event. And looking at the matchup spread, most of the reason is because it was a losing matchup into the two most played decks in the room. You don't have the same ability to interact
interact with the Izzet Prowess deck when they've changed their package up to be a little less about the aggro package, and cards like Into the Floodmaw becoming a 4 of in the deck are just absolutely heinous when you want to be tapping 4 mana for a Sheoldred or an Archfiend of the Dross or some mono black Haymaker, and they just bounce it for 1 mana and then also create a 2/2 trampling haste prowess monk alongside it. Now, the Azorius Omniscience deck was always a little bit harder to interact with, specifically because their main card is an enchantment, and while you can duress it into the graveyard, that's where they want it to be. So you need to back that up with some sort of graveyard hate, and if you're a little too slow, you've lost the game, unfortunately. Now, that's does not mean that the mono black demons deck is absolute garbage, because it is still very good into both variants of Jeskai, and even though it only played 5 matches, has a 60% win rate against the mono red aggro list, which have a lot harder of a time removing things like Preacher of the Schism, Karsi Revenant, and Archfiend of the Dross and Sheoldred. So if looking at mono red's win rate here makes you think you're going to see more of it in standard, mono black demons might go a little bit closer to that 50% win rate, but I'd still be looking at a backup deck. Hey Mono Black Demons fans, have you considered splashing a color as your backup deck? You don't need to buy as many cards when all you're doing is taking your existing ones and upgrading some of the sideboard cards for some better interaction. The Orzhov Demons deck did have a little bit of a better time in Hartford with a 49.5% win rate, or 49.4% in the non-mirror matches, which only accounts for about 14 of them. But regardless, that's still pretty close to a 50% win rate. So if you are still hellbent on playing your big demon package cards, Orzhov is probably the place to go. Now, if you kind of flip back and forth between the video, you'll see that the main difference between these decks and their head-to-head win rates is the fact that Orzhov Demons smashed Oculus even more than Mono Black did, and it flipped the Xur Overlords matchup. Mono Black was 38.5% win rate in that head-to-head, if you forgot about that, but is a 66.7% win rate for the Orzhov Demons deck when you're packing things like Get Lost or Destroy Evil that can very easily deal with some of the Overlords from that deck. The other things are just kind of small little upgrades along the way to some of the other matchups. You're still a losing matchup against Dimir, but you're almost 10% more favored in that matchup than the Mono Black Demons deck was, and you have some small upgrades against the Jeskai control list. Now, of course, you are also beating up on your relative deck with an 85.7% win rate in the Demons mirror matchup, but the Orzhov Demons list looks to be where you may want to settle for better interaction if you are a Mono Black Demons player. And lastly, we have the anti-aggro deck in and of itself, the Orzhov Pixie list. Now, we talked about a little bit earlier that this list actually had a 50% win rate, and when you remove its 10 mirror matches, it had a 50% win rate. And when you look across the matrix of the top 10 Presence decks, you can see how it wound up with a 50% win rate, because it literally has 50% win rate against 4 of these 6 decks. Well, one of them is its mirror matchup, so 3 of these top 10 decks altogether. It also has its favorable matchups against Mono Red Aggro and Izzet Prowess. And because of those 2 matchups, especially the Izzet one being very prevalent in this metagame, that means it balances out its poor matchups a lot better in Hartford than it did in Minneapolis. It is still not the best in Dimir with a 40% win rate in that head-to-head, but it does have a just below 50% head-to-head against the Jeskai Oculus deck and the Jeskai Control deck. So while the Orzhov Pixie deck is still geared towards an aggressive metagame, if Mono Red ticks up, and as long as these black decks are being kept at bay by everything else, the Orzhov Pixie list may still yet have some wings to play with. All right, so I know we're not done with regional championships altogether, although we are starting to wind down on the standard season. I believe there is a RC in Montreal next weekend that I hopefully will have the ability to cover that one as well. It's just been back-to-back chaos with the amounts of events that are going on, as well as hosting our own RCQs at Card Art in Sunnyvale, California. But regardless of this, even though standard is winding down to its RC completion, there is still a bit of time to sling some standard spells out there.
there. So has one of the top 10 win rate decks kind of piqued your interest, or are you still on team Izzet Prowess all the way? What kind of decks would you wind up showing up to play with at the RC in Montreal next week? Let me know in the comments down below what you're thinking about, or if there's something that you've brewed up in and of yourself that you've been inspired by some of these other lists to try out. Now, while you're down there, you can give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this type of content, so I know that, yeah, I probably should just cover the next RC next weekend as well, even though I believe it's going to be a little bit smaller than the North American RCs have been. Now, if you are also so inclined to, you can click the join button down below the video, as well as on the main page of my YouTube channel to become one of my members. Now, members get access to members only benefits, such as getting early access to my content, which is basically as soon as I record and post the video, as well as Discord access and just prized information like having me go over your deck list or do little deck techs for yourself as well in Discord. Now, if you are monetarily able to, I would love to be able to show that support, but if you don't, you can just click the thumbs up button, because that's all the support that I needed from you out there. But if you would like a little bit of extra oomph from me, you can just go down and click that join button to show your devotion. As always, I would also love if you could support me by just tapping that subscribe button. Not only does it help me, but it helps you stay up to date on all sorts of deck techs, metagame analysis like this, and just all of my Magic content I'll be posting. See you from Montreal.
For those attending, I've secured both my tickets and place to stay for the next MagicCon in Las Vegas for Pro Tour Final Fantasy. See you there, and let's sling some spells.